Hi everybody, welcome to the Ramble. I have a question. It's mostly a rhetorical question, but if anybody has a serious answer for it, I'll be willing to entertain the answer if you want to leave a comment. Why isn't vaccination mandatory? I'm speaking in the United States. I'm not sure what the public health policies are in other countries. I know here in the United States it is highly encouraged, but it is not legally mandated for parents to vaccinate their children. And I am just wondering why. What is the basis for vaccination not being something that absolutely must be done? Because many of the anti-vaccination people, many of the parents who choose to not vaccinate their children and go even a step beyond that and make a point of not vaccinating their children and speak out against vaccination in general and try to discourage other people from vaccinating their children, they frame it in terms of personal choice and sort of a parental rights issue. This child is my responsibility. This child is only here because of me, and it's my job to shepherd this child into adulthood, and it's my choice as a parent whether or not this child should be vaccinated or not. That's a decision that I as a parent should be allowed to make. And my question is, why is that a choice that a parent is allowed to make? A parent is not allowed to make the choice, legally speaking, whether or not to have a child ride in a car seat. A parent is not allowed to choose whether or not their child wears a seatbelt. We impose legal ramifications on people, on parents who choose to allow their children to ride in cars without seatbelts or not in car seats if they are below a certain height, if they're a certain age. Why do we not impose similar legal mandates on vaccination, considering what a massive public health issue vaccination and potentially having a large subpopulation of unvaccinated people is? We're seeing diseases that were once thought to be virtually eradicated in the United States all of a sudden popping up again. Here's a story from just recently. This is really the story that has gotten everybody talking about the anti-vax thing again all of a sudden. This is just a New York Times article about it. You can read many other news stories about it. There is an outbreak of measles that apparently began at Disneyland in California and has now spread to 7 different U.S. states. And there are 67 reported cases. And according to this article in the New York Times, they are watching more than 1,000 people just in Arizona they're concerned might have the potential to develop measles. This is not something that should be happening. If parents were vaccinating their children, if everybody was doing their part in vaccinating their fucking kids like they're supposed to, this sort of thing would not be happening, or at least it would not, the potential for something like this to happen on a large scale would not exist. These anti-vax people cite all sorts of reasons for foregoing vaccination for their kids, and not a single one of them holds water. They say that there's a link between vaccination and autism. There's not a shred of evidence to suggest that. They say that vaccines that contain the preservative thimerosal could lead to autism or have some other sort of negative impact on people being vaccinated with them. Not a shred of evidence to support that, and due mostly to the bitching and paranoia of people like that. Most new vaccines don't contain thimerosal in the first place. They whine and bitch about the vaccine schedule as though they know anything about what the fuck they're talking about. They're not doctors, they're not immunologists, they have no idea whether there's a problem with the vaccine schedule or not, but they bitch and they moan about, oh, they're getting so many vaccines. There's not a single shred of evidence to suggest that the vaccine schedule is any kind of a threat to children being vaccinated. They have this sort of just general irrational paranoia about medicine that to me is not unlike the paranoia that you still see from time to time from people about water fluoridation. Even though water fluoridation has been occurring regularly in the United States for 60 or 70 fucking years, there are still people who are really suspicious. Oh, they're putting fluoride in the water. They're putting stuff in the water. And it's the same sort of thing it's the same attitude, the same just completely baseless, foolish, rampant paranoia about, oh, they're doing something to us. There's something in the vaccines, and we're going to be smart, and we're not going to take the vaccines. We're going to outsmart whoever these people are that are trying to harm us. We're not going to take the vaccines. And then there's the paranoia about big pharma. Again, just in general, big pharma's out to get us. Do you know how many billions of dollars they're making off of these vaccines every year? And look, I am not a fan of the very concept of people being able to get rich by selling what are really, to me, necessary medical treatments to people. I feel like vaccination is a must. And I get that people are troubled when they hear how much profit pharmaceutical companies are making by selling necessary drugs. I understand that. If it were up to me, if I could wave a magic wand, I would love, hey, I'm a big government liberal. I would love to see the government come in and take over the whole fucking thing. I seriously would. I would love for the whole enterprise of for-profit medicine to just go away. But that's not the world we live in. And even though pharmaceutical companies do make a lot of money, and they are big companies, and we can wring our hands over some of the tactics that they use, or how much influence they have on the FDA or the CDC, it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not vaccination is a sensible and necessary thing for us to be doing as a society. And honestly, I even though a lot of these anti-vaxxers sort of play at having specific objections, they try to pretend that their problem is with the MMR vaccine in particular, or with thimerosal, or with the profits of the big drug companies. They try to make it sound like they have really specific problems, but ultimately many of them just have a problem with vaccination in and of itself. I was asked a question recently in a You Had to Ask video. What is the most elegant or beautiful fact that I know from science, that I've learned from science? And I gave the Neil deGrasse Tyson answer, where I said, oh, it's the fact that the stuff of which we are made comes from stars, and there's an unbroken chain of events linking each of us all the way back to the Big Bang. But, I could almost just as easily have said vaccination. There's something so elegant and so easy to comprehend about vaccines, about what they do, about how they work. I am not a doctor, I am not an immunologist, but in principle, when it's explained in a way that an idiot like me can comprehend it, it is so simple and so beautiful. You introduce a weakened form of something dangerous into the body reacts to it, responds to it, builds up an immunity, so that if you are ever exposed to a full strength version of whatever you have been vaccinated against, you will be able to fight it off. It is so simple. It's ingenious. It's really ingenious. And it's the first form of immunotherapy, which is something that we are now discovering could be valuable against all sorts of disorders that you would never have associated with immunotherapy before. Cancer, even brain disorders, all kinds of infections, and HIV/AIDS. Immunotherapy has become potentially a hugely powerful and beneficial area of medicine. And vaccination was sort of the first version of that. How much good has come, not just from vaccines themselves and preventing particular diseases, but from learning and realizing that our body's own immune system, if strengthened enough, if directed in the right direction, can be an incredibly powerful tool to protect us against infection and against various diseases, and to improve our health. It's just, it cannot be overstated, the importance of vaccination. I remember my grandfather, Pap, who I've talked about in an earlier episode of this series, having a smallpox vaccine scar right below his shoulder on his arm. And I was always fascinated by it. It was one of the old smallpox vaccine scars, the circular scar. It looked kind of like a sliced lemon. That's sort of the nickname for that kind of a scar, the sliced lemon scar. And I was just fascinated by that. And think of the good that vaccine did. Not just here in the US, but all over the world. Think of the good that the polio vaccine did for people all over the world and is still doing for people all over the world. Think of the good that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine did for us here in the United States, and think of how that good is being undermined and undone because we are too tolerant of foolish parents who would rather trust their own idiotic, uninformed non-expertise on the subject than acknowledge and trust the fact that vaccination is important and necessary. The really offensive thing about so much of this is that it's being done under the guise of protecting their children. I need to protect my children, and they think they need to protect their children from vaccination. What they're actually doing is leaving their children vulnerable to preventable diseases. And not only are they leaving their own children vulnerable, but the more of them who make that choice, the more vulnerable we all become. It's not just a selfish choice to protect their child that is backfiring by making their child vulnerable to a disease that could easily be prevented by a vaccine. It's making all of us vulnerable. It's hurting not just themselves and their children, but all the people around them. It is self-destructive, and it is destructive to other people, and it should not be allowed. It should not be legal to choose to not vaccinate your children. I have a modest proposal with which I would like to close this video. My modest proposal is this. Why don't we review the crimes and the sentences of all of the non-violent drug offenders who are in prison here in the United States, and those that we decide can be safely released? Why don't we commute their sentences, and why don't we release those non-violent drug offenders from prison and send parents who refuse to vaccinate their children to prison? Why don't we do that? Why don't we make that swap? I feel like our society would benefit so greatly if we were just to flip that over. Let the nonviolent drug offenders out, or send them into treatment or to therapy. Let them out of prison. Send the fucking parents who decide not to vaccinate their goddamn kids to prison, because I think that's where they belong. And once they're there, we can do what they should have done in the first place and vaccinate their damn kids.